It was 1974, and Visalia, California, was the kind of town where fear didn't really exist yet. It was a quiet farming community in the San Joaquin Valley, a place where neighbors knew each other's cars, where children played outside until the streetlights hummed to life, and where front doors were often left unlocked because, well, why wouldn't they be? But as the spring breeze drifted through the orchards, something else drifted in with it, a shadow that didn't belong. It started with small things, inconsistencies that made you question your own sanity. You'd come home from work and find your front door slightly ajar, though you swore you closed it. You'd walk into your kitchen and find a half-eaten bowl of cereal on the counter, or a beer bottle drained and left on the table. But nothing of great value was missing. The TV was still there. The jewelry box hadn't been emptied. Instead, he took the small things. He took single earrings. He took piggy banks. He took blue chip stamps. It was baffling. But as the weeks turned into months, the Visalia ransacker, as the police began to call him, grew bolder. He wasn't just stealing. He was performing a ritual of violation. Homeowners would return to find their bedrooms tossed, not looking for money, but looking for intimacy. He would pull out women's underwear and scatter it across the floor, or worse, drape it over family photos. He would take picture frames from the mantel and place them face down, or tear the photographs in half. He wanted you to know he had been there. He wanted you to know he had touched your life while you were sleeping. He was watching. He was always watching. By the summer of 1975, the town was on edge. The police were patrolling, but this phantom seemed to know their shifts better than they did. He moved through the backyards, hopping fences with the agility of a cat, blending into the darkness of the creek beds. He was escalating. He was peeping into windows, scratching at screens, testing the locks. The innocent burglaries were taking on a sinister, heavy weight. The air in Visalia grew thick with the feeling of being hunted. Then came the night of September 11th, 1975. Claude Snelling, a 45-year-old journalism professor at the College of the Sequoias, was asleep in his home on Whitney Lane. It was a typical quiet night until a noise shattered the silence, a stifled scream, the sound of a struggle. Claude jerked awake. The sounds were coming from his teenage daughter Beth's room. Adrenaline surging, Claude didn't hesitate. He ran barefoot toward the commotion. He burst out the back door into the carport and saw a nightmare unfolding in the moonlight. A man dressed in black, his face obliterated by a ski mask, was dragging 16-year-old Beth away. She was terrified, fighting, but he had a grip of iron. "Hey!" Claude shouted, charging forward to save his child. He didn't care about the danger. He only saw his daughter in the hands of a monster. The intruder turned. He didn't run. He didn't panic. He raised a handgun. In the stillness of the neighborhood, 2 shots rang out. Crack! Crack! Claude stumbled. The bullet had torn through him. He collapsed onto the pavement, the life draining from him as his daughter screamed. The intruder, realizing the silence of the night was broken, shoved Beth down and turned to flee. He vanished into the darkness as quickly as he had come, the sound of a stolen bicycle rattling away into the night. Claude Snelling died, saving his daughter. But as the police swarmed the scene, realizing the ransacker had graduated from creepy burglaries to cold-blooded murder, a terrifying realization settled over the valley. This wasn't just a thief. This was a predator who was just getting started, and he was nowhere to be found. The silence that fell over Visalia after Claude Snelling's murder was heavy, but it was a deceptive calm. The predator hadn't stopped. He had simply migrated. Like a virus seeking a new host, he moved 200 miles north to the sprawling, manicured suburbs of Sacramento. It was 1976, the bicentennial year, a time of parades and patriotism. But in the dark corridors of the East Area, specifically neighborhoods like Rancho Cordova and Carmichael, the American dream was about to be shattered by a figure who would become known as the East Area Rapist. The transition was terrifyingly seamless. The quirky burglaries of Visalia, the stolen coins, the moved photos, evolved into something far more malignant. He was done just looking. He was ready to touch. He was ready to destroy. It usually began with a sound that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. The soft, rhythmic click of a sliding glass door being pried open, or the almost imperceptible creak of a window screen being removed. Victims wouldn't wake up to a noise. They would wake up to a blinding beam of white light cutting through the darkness, hitting them directly in the eyes. Before their minds could process the intrusion, a voice, guttural and clenched, would hiss from behind the light. "Freeze. Don't move, or you die." The figure behind the light was a void. He wore a ski mask, sometimes sewn tightly to fit his face, erasing his humanity. He was small in stature, but possessed a terrifying, coiled strength. And he came prepared. He didn't just break in. He hunted. He knew who lived there. He knew the layout of the house. He knew if there was a dog. And often, weeks before an attack, the family dog would mysteriously disappear or be found injured. He had been watching them from the bushes, learning their schedules, becoming a ghost in their own backyards. In the beginning, he targeted women alone, shattering their sense of safety in their own sanctuaries. But as 1976 bled into 1977, his appetite for control grew voracious. He did something that police at the time thought was impossible for a lone sexual predator. He began targeting couples. Imagine the horror. You are lying in bed next to your husband or wife, the safest place in the world, and suddenly you are jolted awake by that blinding light and the cold metal of a gun barrel. The intruder was tactical, moving with the precision of a soldier. He would force the woman to tie up the man, his voice screaming threats that if the knots were too loose, he would kill them both. Then, he would tie the woman up himself. The psychological domination was absolute. He reduced grown men to helpless observers, forcing them to listen to the horror inflicted upon their partners in the next room. The police were baffled. They flooded the streets. They set up secret task forces. Patrol cars cruised the neighborhood slowly, their spotlights sweeping the lawns. But he was always one step ahead. It was as if he could smell the police coming. He utilized the labyrinth of canals, creek beds, and bike trails that wound through Sacramento like veins. He would strike on one street, hop a fence, sprint through a dry creek bed, and vanish into a park miles away before the first siren even wailed. He was a phantom. Panic gripped Sacramento. Hardware stores sold out of deadbolts and window locks. Gun sales skyrocketed. People stopped walking their dogs at night. Every snapping twig, every shadow cast by a swaying tree became him. He wasn't just a criminal anymore. He was a boogeyman, a living urban legend who whispered threats through clenched teeth and vanished into the fog. And the most terrifying part? He was just getting started. The violence was about to turn from brutal to lethal. It wasn't just the violence that made him a monster. It was the theater of cruelty he performed in every home. He didn't just want to rob or assault. He wanted to dismantle the human spirit. He wanted to prove that your home, your sanctuary, belonged to him. His methods weren't random. They were a carefully rehearsed script of psychological warfare a ritual designed to induce a level of terror that paralyzed his victims long before he ever touched them. His signature was in the bindings. He rarely used handcuffs or rope. Instead, he turned the mundane objects of the victim's own life against them. Shoelaces. He had a fascination with them. Sometimes he brought them with him, pockets full of strings, but often he would demand them from the homeowners. He would force the woman to bind the man, screaming instructions, criticizing her knots, making her complicit in her partner's helplessness. Then, he would retie them himself, pulling the laces so tight that circulation cut off, the pain immediate and blinding. He'd truss them up like livestock, ankles to wrists, leaving them in agonizing positions on the floor. But the true horror, the detail that would become the stuff of nightmares for investigators, was the dishes. Once the husband was bound and face down on the bed or floor, the intruder would go to the kitchen. He wasn't looking for a knife. He was looking for plates, saucers, teacups. He would return to the bedroom and carefully, almost delicately, stack the ceramic dishes on the husband's back. Then came the whisper, his voice dropping to a guttural, clenched-tooth hiss that sounded like a snake coiling in the dark. If I hear these dishes rattle, if I hear them fall, I will kill everyone in this house. Imagine that torture. You are bound, blindfolded, and terrified. You can't see what is happening to your wife in the next room. You can only hear. And you know that if you twitch, if you tremble from the adrenaline or the pain, the dishes will slide. The sound of shattering china would be the sound of your family's death sentence. So you lie there, frozen, scarcely breathing, forced to be a statue while a monster roams your home. And roam he did. In a display of chilling casualness, he would treat the house as his own. While the victims lay in terror, he would walk to the kitchen and eat. Survivors reported the surreal, sickening sound of the refrigerator door opening, the clink of a beer bottle, the crunch of leftovers being eaten. He would eat their food, drink their beer, sometimes even watch their television with the volume low, all while they lay helpless nearby. It was the ultimate insult. He was comfortable in their nightmare. He played with time, too. He wouldn't leave quickly. He would stay for hours. He would threaten to leave, letting the silence stretch out, giving the victims a glimmer of hope that he was gone, only to suddenly speak from the corner of the room, "I'm still here." He fed on their despair. Even when he wasn't in the house, he was there. The phone became a weapon. In the weeks leading up to an attack, the phone would ring late at night. Silence, heavy breathing, a hang-up. Sometimes a voice would whisper, "Gonna kill you, gonna kill you." And sometimes, weeks after an attack, the phone would ring again in the home of a survivor. They would pick up, trembling, and hear that same heavy silence, a reminder that he hadn't forgotten them. He was still out there. He still had their number. And he was still watching. The year was 1978, and the tension in Sacramento was brittle, like dry kindling waiting for a spark. The East Area Rapist had attacked nearly 30 times. The community was exhausted. Husbands were sleeping with baseball bats. Wives were terrified to be left alone for even an hour. But until now, the monster had left his victims alive. Shattered, traumatized, and forever changed. Yes, but alive. That unwritten rule, that thin line between a predator and a murderer, was about to be crossed in blood on a chilly February night in Rancho Cordova. It was the evening of February 2nd. Brian Majori, a 21-year-old sergeant in the Air Force Police, and his wife, Katie, 20, were doing something dangerously normal, walking their dog, Thumper. They were a young, happy couple, dealing with the typical stressors of young marriage and military life, trying to reclaim a sense of normalcy in a terrified neighborhood. The streets were dark, the air crisp. They turned down La Gloria Drive, a quiet street lined with the ubiquitous fences and manicured lawns of suburbia. They didn't know it, but they were walking straight into the path of the Phantom. Somewhere in the shadows of a side yard, he was there, prowling. Perhaps he was stalking a new target, peering through a window, or preparing his kit of shoelaces and fear. The exact details of the initial encounter remain a haunting mystery, but evidence suggests Brian and Katie spotted him. Unlike the sleeping victims in their beds, Brian was awake, alert, and trained in law enforcement. He wasn't going to be a passive victim. A confrontation erupted. Voices were raised. A shout shattered the quiet suburban night. This wasn't part of the killer's script. He relied on surprise, on the paralyzing shock of a flashlight in a sleeping face. Here, on the street, exposed and challenged, the cowardice of the bully dissolved into the rage of a killer. Panic ensued. The couple tried to flee. They ran through a side gate, into the backyard of a residence, desperate to escape the masked figure pursuing them. But the predator was fast. He chased them down not to subdue them, but to silence them. A neighbor heard the sound of glass shattering. The couple had crashed through a fence or into a patio door in their desperation. Then, the sounds that changed everything. Bang, bang. Gunshots echoed off the suburban walls. The silence that followed was heavy and final. When the police arrived, the scene was a tableau of heartbreak. Brian and Katie were found in the backyard, lying near each other. They had been executed. The East Area Rapist had become a murderer. The investigation at the scene revealed the chilling signature. Found near the crime scene were pre-cut shoelaces, dropped in the killer's haste to flee. It was him. The tools of his twisted trade were right there. He hadn't come to kill. He had come to rape and terrorize as usual. But when cornered, when faced with a man who fought back, he revealed his true nature. He was willing to kill to protect his identity. The murder of the Majoris sent a shockwave through California that was different from the previous fear. This wasn't just a pervert creeping in the night anymore. This was a cop killer. This was a man who would slaughter a young couple walking their dog just because they saw him. The rules had changed. The police realized they weren't chasing a burglar with a fetish. They were chasing a thrill killer who was evolving. The escalation had begun. And as the heat from the investigation grew too intense in Sacramento, the Phantom did what he always did. He vanished. He packed up his kit of terror and looked south, toward new hunting grounds where no one knew his name, and where the shadows were just as deep. By 1979, the heat in Northern California had become scorching. The East Area Rapist had terrorized Sacramento to the breaking point. The sketches were everywhere, the police were desperate, and the community was armed and waiting. The Majori murders had raised the stakes so high that even he, with all his arrogance, knew he had to disappear. And so, just like smoke in a strong wind, he drifted south. He landed in Goleta, a quiet, upscale community near Santa Barbara. It was perfect for him. Dense brush, dark streets, secluded homes, and dried creek beds for escape. But something had changed in the move. The sexual gratification was no longer enough. The terror he inflicted on his victims, the power of holding their lives in his hands. He needed the final act. He needed the ultimate control. The rapist was molting, shedding his skin to reveal something far worse underneath. On October 1st, 1979, he struck a couple in Goleta. He broke in, bound them. But this time, The victims fought back. They sensed a hesitation in him, a distraction. They managed to escape the house, screaming into the night. The intruder fled on a stolen bicycle, furious. He had failed, and failure was not an option for him. It only fueled a darker, more violent rage. He would not make that mistake again. 3 months later, on December 30th, 1979, he returned to Goleta to correct his error. He targeted the condo of Dr. Robert Offerman and his girlfriend, Deborah Manning. He brought the white nylon twine he now favored. He broke in through the sliding glass door. The familiar script played out, the blinding light, the gun, the guttural commands. He tied them up, but this time, there were no dishes on the back. There was no hours-long torture session of psychological games. He shot them, execution style. When police arrived, the scene was horrific. The binds were intricate, professional. The violence was cold and efficient. They didn't know it yet, but the East Area Rapist had just evolved into the original Night Stalker. The rapist was dead. The serial killer was born. Then, just a few months later in March 1980, he struck again in Ventura, 50 miles down the coast. Lyman Smith, a prominent lawyer who was destined to be a judge, and his wife Charlene. The intruder entered their beautiful home on High Point Drive. He woke them. He tied them up with a drapery cord using a very specific, complex knot, a diamond knot, something a sailor or perhaps someone with specialized training would know. But he didn't use a gun this time. He found a log of firewood, a heavy piece of oak from the fireplace. The brutality was savage. He bludgeoned them to death in their own bed. The violence was so personal, so angry, it shocked even the hardened detectives of Ventura. This was a different beast. The East Area Rapist was a ghost who whispered threats. The original Night Stalker was a butcher. The link between the two wouldn't be officially confirmed for decades, leaving Southern California to tremble in fear of a new killer, unaware it was the same monster from the north, just with a new, bloodier appetite. He was experimenting with death, and he was finding that he liked it. The year 1980 bled into a summer of absolute dread. If the police hoped the monster had satiated his bloodlust in Ventura, they were dead wrong. The original Night Stalker, as he was now being called by a terrified press, was merely migrating again, moving south into the affluent, manicured neighborhoods of Orange County. He was seeking a specific kind of prey, the wealthy, the secure, the people who thought their gated communities and alarm systems could keep the darkness out. It was August 19th, 1980. In the exclusive enclave of Niguel Shores in Laguna Niguel, Keith and Patrice Harrington were living the California dream. They were newlyweds, successful, vibrant. Their home was their castle, but locks and gates meant nothing to a ghost who could melt through fences. Sometime in the dead of night, he slipped in. There was no forced entry that the police could easily find later. Perhaps a sliding door left unlocked for a breeze, or a lock picked with terrifying ease. He crept into their bedroom. The ritual began again. The blinding light. The ligatures. He tied them up, securing their wrists and ankles with the same cold, practiced efficiency he had used dozens of times before. But the game had changed. There was no long, drawn-out psychological torture this time. There were no dishes stacked on backs. He wasn't there to play. He was there to destroy. He found a weapon of opportunity, a heavy brass sprinkler head, likely taken from the garden. The violence was sudden and catastrophic. He bludgeoned them to death in their own bed. It was a frenzy of rage, a brutal, messy end to two beautiful lives. When Keith's father found them the next day, The scene was so horrific it defied description. The sheer anger required to kill two people that way. It chilled the detectives to the bone. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was hatred. 6 months passed. The trail went cold, as it always did. Then, on February 6, 1981, he struck in Irvine. Manuela Withun was home alone. Her husband was in the hospital with a viral infection, leaving her vulnerable in their quiet house. Did the killer know? Did he watch the husband leave and not return? Or was he just prowling, testing doors until he found one that yielded? He broke in. He found Manuela. He bound her. And then he beat her to death. The savagery was identical to the Harrington murders. He left her body to be found by her devastated husband upon his return from the hospital. The cruelty of it, to survive an illness only to come home to a slaughterhouse, was unbearable. But the bloodiest year wasn't over. In July 1981, the killer returned to his old hunting grounds in Goleta, the site of his earlier failures and successes. He targeted Sherry Domingo and her boyfriend, Gregory Sanchez. This time, the victim fought back. Gregory Sanchez wasn't going to go quietly. Evidence suggested a struggle, a desperate attempt to stop the inevitable. The killer didn't hesitate. He shot Sanchez, then bludgeoned him. He then turned his rage on Sherry. It was a massacre. And in a chilling final act, he ransacked the house, not for money, but to assert dominance. He ate their food. He lingered. He left his DNA, a microscopic signature that he thought would never be read, scattered across the scene. By the end of 1981, Southern California was in a state of panic. Gun sales soared. Neighborhood watch groups patrolled the streets with flashlights and baseball bats. But the original Night Stalker was a phantom. He had killed 10 people in Southern California in less than 2 years. He seemed unstoppable. He seemed to know exactly when the police were looking left so he could strike right. And then, just as the fear reached its peak, silence. The attacks stopped. The phone calls ceased. The shadow vanished. The bloodiest years ended not with a bang, but with a terrifying, unexplained quiet. Where did he go? Was he dead? Was he in prison for something else? Or was he just waiting? The silence that had settled over Southern California in 1981 lasted for 5 long years. People began to exhale. They began to believe that the monster had moved on, or perhaps died. But the original Night Stalker wasn't finished. He had one final act of cruelty left in him, a reminder that he was still the master of the dark. It was May 4th, 1986. Irvine, California. Janelle Cruz was 18 years old, a vibrant young woman with her whole life ahead of her. Her family was away for the night, leaving her alone in their quiet, suburban home. It was the scenario he had always hunted for. He slipped into the house. The details were sickeningly familiar to the detectives who would later walk the scene. There was no forced entry, perhaps a window left unlatched, or a garage door opener stolen months prior. He found Janelle. He bound her. The violence that followed was explosive. He bludgeoned her to death, shattering her face and her future. But then, as quickly as the rage came, it vanished. He disappeared into the night, leaving behind a grieving family and a community plunged back into a nightmare. And then nothing. This time, the silence was permanent. The killings stopped. The rapes stopped. The phantom simply ceased to exist. Years turned into decades. The files gathered dust in boxes marked cold. Detectives retired, haunted by the one who got away. The world moved on. The 80s became the 90s, and the 90s bled into the new millennium. But he hadn't forgotten. In 2001, 24 years after he had terrorized Sacramento, the phone rang in the home of one of his early victims. She was older now, her life rebuilt, the trauma buried deep. She picked up the phone. A whisper, cold and mocking, drifted through the line. "Remember when we played?" He was still out there. He was watching. He was taunting them. An old man now, reveling in the pain he had caused. It was around this time that science finally caught up to the monster. For years, police believed they were hunting two separate predators, the East Area Rapist in Northern California and the original Night Stalker in Southern California. They were too different, they thought. One was a rapist who bound victims. The other was a bludgeoning murderer. But in 2001, a determined investigator decided to test DNA samples from the different crime scenes. The result was a bombshell that rocked the law enforcement world. The DNA from the Sacramento rapes matched the DNA from the Southern California murders perfectly. There were no two killers. It was one man, one monster who had commuted across the state, evolving, learning, and killing. The scale of his crimes was suddenly visible. Over 50 rapes and at least 10 murders, spanning a decade and hundreds of miles. They gave this new, unified profile a name, the Golden State Killer. But even with the DNA connecting the crimes, they still lacked the most important piece of the puzzle. They had his genetic fingerprint, but they didn't have a name. He was a ghost with a DNA profile, a shadow who had managed to live a normal life while harboring the darkest secrets imaginable. The case was cold, but the science was heating up. And soon, a new kind of detective, one without a badge, would step into the light. The year was 2016, and the monster had been a ghost for 30 years. To the public, he was a fading nightmare, a bedtime story told to scare new police recruits. But for a select few, he was an obsession that refused to die. One of those obsessed was Michelle McNamara. She wasn't a cop. She was a true crime writer, a civilian with a laptop and a burning need for truth. She spent her nights prowling the dark corners of the internet, sleuthing through old police reports, dissecting the timelines, and humanizing the victims. She realized that the clunky acronyms the police used, ER, ONS, VR, were distancing the public from the reality of the horror. She gave him a new name, a name that stuck, a name that would finally bring the case back into the sunlight, the Golden State Killer. Her work, culminating in the book, I'll Be Gone in the Dark, electrified the world. She brought the case out of the filing cabinets and into the cultural zeitgeist. But tragically, Michelle would not live to see the end of the story. She passed away in her sleep in 2016, leaving her husband and her research behind. But she had lit a fire. The world was watching again. Meanwhile, in Contra Costa County, investigator Paul Holes was staring at the calendar. He was nearing retirement. For 24 years, this case had been his shadow. He had visited the crime scenes. He had held the evidence. He had the killer's DNA profile sitting in a freezer. But the DNA was useless. It had been run through CODIS, the National Criminal Database, again and again. No match. The killer had never been arrested for a felony, or at least, not one where his DNA was taken. Holes knew that if he retired, the case might die with his career. He needed a Hail Mary. He needed something radical. He began to read about a new, controversial field, genetic genealogy. It was used by people to find birth parents or long-lost relatives. It wasn't designed for hunting serial killers. But Holes had a thought. What if I don't look for the killer? What if I look for his family? If the killer hadn't put his DNA in a database, maybe his second cousin had. Maybe a distant aunt had wanted to find her heritage. In a move that would change the future of forensics forever, Holes teamed up with a brilliant genetic genealogist named Barbara Ravenner. They took the Golden State Killer's DNA, the very essence of the monster left at the scene of the 1980 killings, and they did the unthinkable. They uploaded it to a public genealogy website called GeneMatch. They held their breath. They weren't asking the database for a name. They were asking for a thread. The results came back. There was no direct match. No brother, no father, no son. But there were cousins. Distant cousins. Third cousins. People who shared great-great-grandparents with the killer. It was a needle in a haystack, but for the first time in 40 years, the haystack was defined. Holes and Ravenner began the painstaking work of building a family tree in reverse. They went back to the 1800s, finding the common ancestors, and then began tracing the lineage forward, branch by branch, generation by generation. It was a tedious, mind-numbing process. They had to find a branch that led to a male, born between 1945 and 1955, who had lived in Visalia, Sacramento, and Southern California. They were hunting a ghost through birth certificates, marriage licenses, and census records. The list of suspects was shrinking. From thousands of possibilities, they narrowed it down to a few families, then a few brothers. And finally, as the spring of 2018 bloomed, the tree pointed to one specific branch. There was a man. He was the right age. He had lived in all the right places. And most chilling of all, he was a former police officer. The ghost finally had a shape, but they couldn't just arrest him. They needed his DNA to be sure. They needed to touch the monster without him knowing he had been found. It was April 2018, and the net was tightening around a ghost. The family tree that Paul Holes and Barbara Ravenner had painstakingly built had led them to a terrifyingly specific demographic. A man born in the mid-1940s, with ties to the military and law enforcement, who had lived in Visalia during the Ransacker era and Sacramento during the East Area Rapist era. The name at the end of the branch was Joseph James DeAngelo. It fit. It fit perfectly. DeAngelo was a former police officer. He had worked for the Exeter Police Department, near Visalia, from 1973 to 1976, the exact years the ransacker was active. Then, he had moved to the Auburn Police Department, near Sacramento, in 1976, right when the East Area Rapist began his reign of terror. He had been fired in 1979 for shoplifting a hammer and dog repellent, tools of a burglar. The timeline was a lock. But a timeline isn't proof. They needed his DNA. On April 18, 2018, a covert surveillance team from the Sacramento County Sheriff's Department set up shop in Citrus Heights, a quiet suburb of Sacramento. They were watching a modest, beige single-story house. The man living there was 72 years old. To his neighbors, he was Joe, a grumpy retiree who spent his days meticulously caring for his lawn, yelling at people who made too much noise, and occasionally riding his motorcycle. He was a grandfather. He was a mechanic. He was ordinary. But as the investigators watched him through telephoto lenses, they saw something else. They saw the posture. They saw the vigilance. This wasn't just a cranky old man. This was a predator in hibernation. The team needed a sample. They couldn't ask for it. They couldn't get a warrant yet. They had to wait for him to discard something. A cup, a tissue, anything that would carry his genetic code. They tailed him. DeAngelo drove his car to a Hobby Lobby store. He parked and went inside. The surveillance team saw their chance. While he was shopping, Unaware that the ghosts of his past had finally caught up to him, a detective approached his vehicle. With the precision of a thief, ironic, considering who they were hunting, the detective swabbed the door handle of DeAngelo's car. They rushed the swab to the lab. The waiting was agonizing. Was this it? Was this the end of the 40-year nightmare? Or was it another dead end? The preliminary results came back. It was a match. But in a case of this magnitude, pretty sure wasn't enough. They needed a second sample to be absolutely certain before they took down a man who might be armed and dangerous. 3 days later, on April 23rd, they followed him again. This time, DeAngelo walked out of a store and tossed a crumpled tissue into a public trash can. As soon as he drove away, the team swooped in. They retrieved the tissue, sealing it like it was the crown jewels. Back at the lab, the technicians ran the sample against the Golden State Killer's DNA profile, the semen left at the scene of the Smith murders in 1980. The computer screen flashed the result. It wasn't just a familial match. It was a direct match. The probability that it was anyone else was 1 in quadrillions. The room went silent. The monster had a name. The East Area Rapist. The original Night Stalker, the Visalia Ransacker. He was real. He wasn't a supernatural force. He was Joseph James DeAngelo, a 72-year-old man living in the suburbs, sleeping in a warm bed while his victims' families had spent decades in agony. Paul Holes, the man who had chased this ghost for half his life, looked at the name. He drove to the house in Citrus Heights. He parked down the street and just stared at it. He wanted to see where the devil lived. He realized that for decades, DeAngelo had been living amongst them, hiding in plain sight, likely following the news of the investigation, laughing at their failures. But the laughter was over. The hunt was finished. Now, it was time for the takedown. It was the afternoon of April 24th, 2018. The sun was shining on the quiet streets of Citrus Heights, a perfect picture of suburban normalcy. Joseph James DeAngelo, the man who had haunted the nightmares of California for 40 years, was standing in his driveway. He was working on a project, perhaps thinking about his dinner, completely unaware that the world he had built on a foundation of secrets was about to collapse. The teams moved in. It wasn't a raid with sirens and SWAT teams kicking down doors. It was a surgical strike. As DeAngelo turned, he saw the officers swarming him. The shock on his face was genuine. For decades, he had believed he was smarter than them. He had believed he had won. But as the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, the illusion shattered. He was just an old man, caught in the sunlight. "I have a roast in the oven," he muttered, a banal, absurd comment from a man who had just been unmasked as the Golden State Killer. It was the last shred of his ordinary life slipping away. In the interrogation room, the facade of the grumpy retiree crumbled, replaced by something far more disturbing. When detectives left him alone, cameras captured him pacing, muttering to himself. He wasn't talking to God. He was talking to Jerry. "I did all that," he whispered to the empty room, his voice trembling. "I didn't have the strength to push him out. He made me. He went with me. It was like he was in my head. I mean, he was a part of me. I didn't want to do those things. I pushed Jerry out, and I had a happy life. I did all those things. I destroyed all their lives. So now I've got to pay the price." It was a glimpse into the fractured mind of a monster, or perhaps a final, desperate attempt to feign insanity. But the prosecutors weren't buying it. They knew exactly who he was. A cold, calculated predator who had stopped killing not because he was cured, but because he had gotten too old to physically dominate his victims. The legal process was slow, agonizing for the survivors who had waited decades for this moment. When DeAngelo finally appeared in court, he was unrecognizable. He was wheeled in, looking frail, his mouth slack, his eyes vacant. He seemed unable to comprehend the proceedings. Many of the victims' families watched in disgust, convinced it was just another mask, the feeble old man, act designed to garner sympathy or delay the inevitable. But the evidence was overwhelming. The DNA didn't lie. The souvenirs found in his home, tokens taken from victims decades ago, didn't lie. In June 2020, amidst a global pandemic, the final chapter was written. Because of the sheer number of victims and the need for social distancing, the hearing was held in a university ballroom in Sacramento. It was a surreal setting for a historic moment. To avoid the death penalty, which, given his age and the lengthy appeals process in California, he likely would never have faced anyway, DeAngelo agreed to plead guilty. He sat in his wheelchair, listening as the prosecutors read the details of his crimes. Rape, murder, kidnapping, torture. For hours, the catalog of horror went on. And for every charge, a frail, raspy voice answered, "Guilty, guilty, guilty." He admitted to 13 murders and dozens of rapes. He admitted to being the Visalia ransacker. He admitted to being the East Area Rapist. He admitted to being the original Night Stalker. The three faces of terror were finally fused into one. Then came the victim impact statements. For 3 days, the survivors and the families of the dead stood up. They looked the monster in the eye. They told him he hadn't broken them. They told him he was small. They told him that while he rotted in a cell, they had lived, they had loved, and they had won. "You are nothing," one survivor told him. "You are a shadow, and we are the light." On August 21st, 2020, Judge Michael Bowman delivered the sentence. He looked at DeAngelo and said, "When a person commits monstrous acts, they need not be a monster. But you, sir, are a monster." Joseph James DeAngelo was sentenced to multiple consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. He would die in prison. The Golden State Killer, the man who had once made entire communities sleep with one eye open, was wheeled out of the courtroom and into oblivion. The boogeyman was real, yes, but he was also caught. And finally, after 44 years of darkness, the sun could truly rise over California.